John Higgins, a newly appointed fellow of the University of Cape Town, but before then, for many years, ardent chair in the English department. He's also a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa and the author, among many publications, of the award-winning study Raymond Williams' Literature, Marxism and Cultural Materialism, and more recently, Academic Freedom in a Democratic South Africa. And as you're about to discover or learn for yourself in practical terms, he is a recipient of UCT's Distinguished Teachers Award. Thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Can you hear me okay? I'm afraid I've got seawater in my ears, so I can't hear very well, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to hear me. Just speak up very loudly if you can't hear. So welcome everybody to the 5 days of talks and speaking that will be here. We'll close each session with some discussion of things, so it won't be just a talking head, a little bit of discussions. I'm sure that's also what you're here for. And the topic, as I'm sure you know as you sign up for it, is called Catastrophe, Science Fiction and the Sustainable Development Goals. And the idea for the seminar really came from the appalling sense of catastrophe which has been weighing on me and I think on other people for several years now. This course started as an undergraduate course, I think 2 or 3 years ago. And I'm sorry to say things have not got better since the course began, but have been getting gradually worse. And this led to a kind of multiplication of directions in my own work, which I'll just tell you about to fill you in on the background to the course, which I began to do some work quite directly on the Sustainable Development Goals, working particularly with a Norwegian researcher, and we wrote an essay on the idea of growth, economic growth in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, and trying to look critically at them and so on. But I'm primarily, in some sense at least, a literature teacher rather than a political economist or sociologist or whatever. So I wanted to find some way of giving attention to the Sustainable Development Goals through literature. And what occurred to me as a kind of lifelong science fiction addict from the age of 12 or 13 or whatever, was that the genre of science fiction had had a long and sustained engagement with issues of ecology, of climate change, which the Sustainable Development Goals are on. So I thought an interesting course would be on looking at just a few texts, almost random in a way, a few texts from the science fiction tradition which kind of interacted with the core ideas of sustainable development and climate change. And so that's the course in that sense. And the texts, as you know, I mean, I feel quite bad because there are so many interesting texts that we could talk about, and many of which you may yourselves like and want to talk about, which I think you can bring into discussion. But you have to select some for a series like this. So the ones that came to mind, more or less immediately, were Frank Herbert's novel Dune from 1965, 66 or so, which has been one of the most popular science fiction novels and led to a whole range of sequels, both by Frank Herbert himself and also, a little unusually really, by his children, who also took over the series and wrote another 10 or 12 novels in addition to the 3, 4 or 5 that he did. So there's something about that text which has proved really captivating. Also shown in the fact that, as well as this now shelf-long array of novels, there's been a projected film, a realised film by David Lynch, a whole TV series, and interesting, I didn't know this at the time, by the end of this new year, there'll be a new version of Dune by someone I regard as a very good filmmaker, Denis Villeneuve, who also did a version of Blade Runner, which I'll probably mention or talk about a little bit later on. And he's coming out with a version of Dune at the end of this year. So in other words, Dune is what we call a canonical novel. It's one whose appeal goes beyond its first publication and its first generation of readers, across generations, even across media into different media, suggesting that there's something in it which is really interesting. Because there's two kinds of books, if you like. One book that you only read once, that's still enjoyable, but you're not going to read it again because it's not complex or intriguing enough. And then there are books which are complex and intriguing, which you can spend your life reading, like Joyce's Ulysses, for instance. And then there are, it's a spectrum, there are those in between, which you can read 5 times, 10 times, 15 times, or whatever. Similarly, Philip K. Dick, who Frederick Jameson, a great American critic, referred to as the Shakespeare of science fiction, for the sheer amount of work he produced, its verbal ingenuity, its excitement, its very unique body of work. He wrote a novel called Do Androids Dream of Electronic Sheep, which has also had this canonical capacity to live across generations, also a book from the 60s, still in print, and to have been made into now 2 films, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner and Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner, second version of that. And I don't know what you've read, you can talk about it. Philip K. Dick is, as I say, an amazing science fiction writer, but almost not a science fiction writer. He's just like a weird writer who sort of fits for science fiction things. Very, very interesting. Cormac McCarthy is not usually thought of as a science fiction novelist. He's thought of as a novelist, pure and simple. And his extraordinary book, The Road, I put in to the course because it's definitely about catastrophe. It's not head-on about sustainable development goals and climate change in that way, but it reveals what I call a catastrophic world and what humans might be like in that catastrophic world. So that's a really extraordinary book. And then I came across the work of a Chinese science fiction writer, Cixin Liu, probably not pronouncing it correctly, who's by profession a computer guy, but who took up writing and has written a huge amount, of which the 3-body problem is the first volume of 3 in a series that looks far into the distant future of humanity. And it's the most incredible series. I read it, I think about 3 years ago, after reading a review about it in the London Review of Books. And it really is an extraordinary piece of fictional writing. And I thought it might be something which you hadn't come across, and so it would be interesting to bring into your field of attention. And this is a particularly interesting book for the moment because it's written by a Chinese author who's been brought up in China in the particular constraints of Chinese socialization, Chinese politics, but who's somehow got into this Western genre of science fiction. And it's a very, I'm surprised it's been published actually, because it has such critical things to say about the Chinese system of society. So it's a really amazing book. So I'm advising you that if you've taken the trouble to sign up and pay for the course, to go that extra mile or that extra bit on your credit card to get hold of the books and to have a look at the books.
And you ask the bookshop?
The series, yeah.
Upstairs.
Yeah. So the purpose of this course is to just talk about these books in relation to this theme of catastrophe, as a way of linking them and enabling you to read them. And that's really all we're doing, I think. So the first thing to say is about science fiction, which is, as a literary critic, it's only in the past 40 years or so that science fiction has come into literary studies. In the original moment of the formation of literary studies in the 1920s, mass fiction and writing was seen as the enemy. F.R. Leavis, the founding critic of the discipline in many ways, wrote a pamphlet in 1922 called Mass Civilization and Minority Culture. And he saw literary studies as training people in the understanding of minority culture against a civilization which was becoming a mass civilization, lowering the value of culture and understanding. So, in that version, science fiction would belong to mass civilization, and therefore it wasn't admitted into the canon. And that lasted for quite a long time, and the key moment of change was probably when one of the angry young men writers, the funniest of them, Kingsley Amis, you may have read his Lucky Jim or other related works, also liked science fiction, felt quite guilty about it because he'd been brought up with a literary education that said science fiction must be bad, but he faced his contradictions and wrote one of the first studies of science fiction called New Maps of Hell, after a series of lectures he gave in the USA in 1959, which was published in 1960, which began to set up that it was respectable to study science fiction and to take it seriously. And since then, since that 1960 publication, literary criticism has taken up science fiction. And I wanted to just say a little bit about how it's taken it up, or how I think of it as taking it up. It's that science fiction tends to deal with things which trouble us, but which are often on the margins of our attention. And these writers will get interested in something and create a whole world out of what is quite marginal at the time. And that's one of the things which I've developed this little historical thing for, because Dune is perhaps the first novel whose structure and plot and dynamics is taken from ecology. In the mid-60s, ecology wasn't something you heard about very much. In 1963, one of the founding texts of the ecology movement, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, was published. And that was like the first thing to almost even bring the word ecology into public consciousness. But it was a very marginal interest. So it's quite astounding that Frank Herbert should, within a couple of years, develop a whole novel, which, as I'll talk about in more detail tomorrow, is actually ecology is right at the centre of that. And interestingly, for our moment, it's not only ecology which is centralised, but there's actually a really interesting engagement in a displaced fictional way with Islam, and also with the politics of oil, and with a whole range of stuff, which is this array of different complicated things is what makes Dune a novel which has survived its time, because it's got so many funny bits and bats to it. So well, that's what we'll be talking about tomorrow. But first,
officials have declared a state of emergency.
what's happening? So, I don't know how many of you have read The Road, or seen the movie, or perhaps both. But The Road is one of the most powerful novels of the past decade or so. You can't read it without being really moved by it, and it's incredibly powerful. And as you saw in that little ad for the film, what it does is present you with extremely powerful images of what I call the catastrophic world, the world after ecological crisis or catastrophes of various kind. And what I want to suggest is that these images are at the margins, have been at the margins of our consciousness for quite some time. And that science fiction in particular has pulled these marginal fears and anxieties and made them the central focus of attention in narratives. Now what's funny is that when I started with this clip, is that in the clip you see newsreel footage of various natural disasters which are being used for this fictional film, The Road. But my next
Yes.
What's happened even since that film was made is that what were documentary images turned into fictional images for a fictional narrative are now becoming everyday real documentary images again. So here's a photo of burning Australia from today's Guardian. So this is notes from the present.
And my Kiwi friends are telling me that they're having big problems because there's no sun. There's
no
too
sun.
much fallout.
Yeah.
So they're experiencing equal discomfort.
So the road, which was this fantasy fiction, in part is already being fulfilled in Australia. So I mean, my courses, I'm afraid my course, which was looking like this might happen, you know, I'm afraid it's happening even more. So this is in Jakarta, Indonesia, an image also just from the newspaper, of massive floods. And this is at a moment where, you know, for usually self-interested and commercial reasons, there's still climate denialism. From the Prime Minister of Australia, from Donald Trump, from all sorts of powerful people. So what interests me there is the way science fiction, in its, you know, from the 60s onwards, has been presciently trying to bring to the centre of our attention marginal fears and so on. And that's one of the things which all fiction tends to do, and maybe science fiction in particular. It deals with stuff which at some level everybody feels or is a little bit afraid of, but puts it into a narrative form where you can focus on it a little more comfortably because you know it's fiction. But what's troubling is that the fiction is fast turning into reality as we move. So this is from 2014, from one of the greatest living, again it's difficult, science fiction writers or writers who write science fiction, William Gibson, who wrote his great novel Neuromancer on a typewriter, but Neuromancer famously predicted the rise of the internet before it happened, created a whole fictional universe around the internet before it happened, but composed on a manual typewriter, not in the computer. The Peripheral 2014, again, the novel embodies this sense of impending catastrophe, but it's written from a future in which the catastrophe has already happened. And it describes that catastrophe as the jackpot, you know, humorously, ironically calling the catastrophe the jackpot. And one of the characters in the novel explains to a younger person who's grown up since the catastrophe happened, how did it happen? And he explains, first of all, it was no one thing. It was multi-causal with no particular beginning and end. It was more like a climate than an event. It was androgenic, he said, meaning caused by humans. Not that they'd known what they were doing, had meant to make problems, but they'd caused it anyway. And in fact, the actual climate, the weather, caused by there being too much carbon, had been the driver for a lot of other things. How that got worse and never better was just expected to ongoing. Because people in the past, clueless as to how that worked, had fucked it all up, then not being able to get it together to do anything about it, even after they knew, and now it was too late. Now there you have what science fiction can do Often it's set in the future, but of course the future has its roots in the past, and that past is our present. And that's the way science fiction, which can seem far from the present, connects to the present, because its own sense of the future present is usually rooted in things in our present, which is its past. So that's kind of its appeal and how it works. So this describes, it's almost like a speech from Greta Thunberg, in other words. But this was written before she entered the public arena. And again, shows the ways in which science fiction, or a part of it, is really deeply concerned with the problems that the Sustainable Development Goals have been developed to try and face to stop this happening, even after they knew, and we do know, but we have to act. So all of these fictions are really engaged, and I said before we've chosen, there are so many others which we could talk about. There's a great J.G. Ballard, was an early exponent from his catastrophic childhood in the East. The Drought, The Drowned World, and many other texts of his they were also early to mid-60s, also were looking at global climate change and what would happen. They're just amazing novels, but I can't do more than mention them right now. And just to, because it's so difficult when I don't know you. You know me, you're not my student when I'm talking, so forgive me if I say too much or too little. It's just bound to happen. But I wanted to just give you, in case you don't know science fiction at all, just like a brief history of science fiction in a minute or so, and look at a few texts. Science fiction has always been with us as a kind of text which, one way to look at it is, it simply isn't rooted in the present or in known history. It does something a little bit different by trying to imagine a future. But what's important is that its imagining of the future is a way of talking indirectly about the present. It goes back to Lucian's A True Story. I'm sure you've all read Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels, this great imaginary thing, not set in the future but in other worlds. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, perhaps one of the most famous texts of this unreal reality. 19th century into 20th century, Edgar Allan Poe, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells. 1912, a particular favourite of my 13-year-old self was Edgar Rice Burroughs' A Princess of Mars and the Mars things. All the way through, Aldous Huxley, lots and lots of other people. Theodore Sturgeon's More Than Human, 61, Solaris, made into a couple of films recently, Ballad, The Drowned World, Dune, Do Android Dream, the great feminist writer Ursula Le Guin. So there's like a huge amount of things. So I'm hoping, one reason for the course is to give you a list like this and to encourage you, if you've not read much science fiction, to have a look at some of these books. And they're great books, they're in a different, they're genre fiction, but they're really interesting. More recently, William Gibson. I've mentioned Margaret Atwood, you may know, I'm sure you know already, The Handmaid's Tale is another dystopian fiction. Kim Stanley Robinson, The Mars Trilogy, a fantastic recent thing. Another novelist who's regarded as a novelist but has also written science fiction is the great Kazuo Ishiguro, and this very moving novel, or I found it a very moving novel about human cloning called Never Let Me Go, absolutely heart-wrenching, something to look at. and the one I just quoted from Gibson's The Peripheral Eye, 2014. Just some stuff to read and to show you that this is bigger than these few books we're looking at. So what I'm saying or suggesting to you is that science fiction takes social anxieties which are kind of at the periphery of most people's lives and brings them through narrative to central attention. But the idea that started the course is fast becoming out of date because the reality of climate change is proving ever more visible. So in fact my course is a little bit displaced now, but I think you can see what I mean nonetheless. Science fiction has been dealing with issues around climate change for 50 odd years, and it's interesting to look at that. From a contemporary perspective, there's now no doubt that the things that science fiction has been banging on about for 50 years really need to be taken seriously. There's this fantastic report from 2018, quite short, quite easy to read, you can download it, it's not super long. We've just got 12 years to act to keep global warming to a maximum of 1.5 degrees. The current level of what countries are committing to, the world is on course for a disastrous 3 degrees of warming, which disastrous means virtually the end of humanity. So the road magnified or whatever. The co-chair of the report says, there's a line in the sand, what it says to our species, this is the moment, we must act now. Or we'll be in what William Gibson, 4 years before the report was published, said, otherwise we're in for the jackpot, where all these factors come together, we're absolutely in a bad way. Back in '62, American writer Rachel Carson wrote quite an influential book called Silent Spring, which was one of the first to look particularly at the influence of pesticides on the environment. And I mention her because this is one of the foundational texts of the ecological writing, and also because if you read The Three-Body Problem, it's directly quoted, a whole section from Silent Spring. And also it was influential for Frank Herbert, and I'll talk about Frank Herbert a bit more tomorrow. So it's a foundational text from ecology. And she puts it like this. You'll note that she puts it as a narrative. Narrative is a powerful form for communicating with people. And one of the problems is that the UN reports on climate change tend to address, in a sense, only experts. And it's hard to move people with UN reports, which I admire tremendously as an academic for the work that goes into them. But they don't really connect to people. So that's one of the reasons why I think science fiction is quite important, because it can connect the abstract scientific reasoning and stuff to people in a vivid and dramatic and emotional sort of way. So in this text, it's not surprising that she writes in a narrative way. Once upon a time, so it's not once upon a time, there was once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings. Along the roads, laurel, viburnum and alder, grape ferns and wildflowers delighted the traveller's eye. Then a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. There was a strange stillness. The birds, where had they gone? No witchcraft, no enemy action had silenced the rebirth of a new life in this stricken world. The people had done it to themselves. So again, that's the connecting thread between the official reports, the science fiction writing, the ecological writing. We are responsible. But that we is complex because it's not just the individual coalitions that make up the we, it's the political actors that make up different we's. And that's also something that science fiction tries to deal with. Okay, I mean, just briefly, other early warnings were a great little book from 1972 called The Limits to Growth, which gave us these warnings quite some time ago. And more recently, Stephen Hawking, the great astro person, who I used to wheel across the bridge in Cambridge when he was in his early days in the wheelchair. But just before he died, issued this warning, which again is taken up by science fiction, or was imagined by science fiction many years in advance of 2018. He was sure that during this next century, people will discover how to modify both intelligence and instincts. Laws will probably be passed against genetic engineering with humans, but some people won't be able to resist the temptation. You may have noticed in the newspapers yesterday that the Chinese scientists who've been experimenting on human genetic engineering has been sentenced to prison for 3 years or 6 years, I can't remember. Once such superhumans appear, there will be significant political problems with unimproved humans who won't be able to compete. The children's author, Robert Muchamore, his not most recent novel, but the one before, dealt with these superhumans and genetic engineering, CRISPR, and so on. Text. So all of these things, all of these fears and anxieties are what the great project for the Sustainable Development Goals seek to answer. And we have a very limited time to address these. We're already failing, or many countries are failing in this, so it's still a huge political initiative is necessary to push for these things to ensure human survival in a reasonable way. Now, what I wanted to bring into the course as well as Sustainable Development Goals and a selection of science fiction narratives and writing was a very basic political perspective, because, as I suggested a moment ago, this pronoun we is always so troubling, because it means, the responsibility is ours. So like if we put our plastic rubbish in one, that will help and stuff like that. But we's are not so simple, because political actors are we's who are not us, and we have to engage with those. And at the core of this, so we're not entirely pessimistic, is the history of political theory can give us a bearing on this problem if we recognize that there's a spectrum of political arguments around collective action and the nature of society. And it's really important to recognize that there is a spectrum and that alternatives are possible, particularly at moments when it seems there's only one kind of politics. So that's why I've chosen as bearings, political bearings from the history of political theory, almost at random. You know, you've got to choose some texts with hundreds and hundreds of others, but you've got to make some choices. So I've chosen as the exemplars of two opposite ends of the spectrum, Thomas Hobbes and Adam Smith. And I begin with a quotation from a former tutor of mine, John Donne, great political philosopher, used to terrify me as a student, who asked in one essay, "Is struggle and enmity what politics must always be about? Is there no room for collaboration? Is it always just Trump and Sandra?" And what I generally suggest is that in these fictions that are mainly what I'll be talking about, you know, one way of approaching them is that all these post-catastrophe narratives, one way of thinking about them and analysing them is that they tend to narratively place people in what political theory, following Rousseau and others, refers to as a state of nature. In other words, a state before civilization has really developed, before societies have developed, a kind of or originary state of human interaction. And because these science fiction narratives, these catastrophic narratives, do this, they tend to put into play the extremes of two recurrent views of how societies actually hold together. And South Africa is very concerned with this, with the very shallow discourse on social cohesion, which runs through a lot of contemporary sociological and political thinking. How do societies hold together? Is it through fear, or is it through bonds of human sociability? And, you know, I say that lots of people talk about this. You know, I've just chosen two who, for me, kind of perfectly represent these alternatives. And they're Thomas Hobbes and Adam Smith, 17th century British thinker, 18th century Scottish thinker. So let me tell you a little bit more about these things. And why I'm saying this is that one way of reading the four texts I've chosen, if you think as a student, is that you could write an essay about what is the state of nature represented in each of these four narratives. Is it one that's Hobbesian, or is it one that's Smithian, or is it a mixture, or whatever? It just gives you a frame for understanding some of the dynamics of these science fiction narratives. Now, it's not usual to bring into literary criticism the history of political theory, but I find it a very enlightening way of getting people to read and understand texts and to expand their knowledge and understanding. So that's sort of what I do. And Thomas Hobbes was brought up during the English Civil War, and he was a coward. He lived in terror. You know, civil wars are not a nice thing, whether they're in the Congo or in Britain in the 17th century. People being ripped apart literally in front of your eyes. It's a horrible, horrible thing. So Hobbes's theory is deeply rooted in his own fear of violence. He said at one point, "Fear has been the consuming passion of my life." And his political theory is one of the most extreme theories which try and imagine how a society can hold together against violence. But it's through fear. And he writes in one of his early writings, a book called The Citizen, the original of all great and lasting societies consisted not in the mutual goodwill that men had towards each other, but in the mutual fear they had of each other. Fear is at the centre of Hobbes's social theory. And when we come to look at the road in particular, but also a three-body problem, we'll see how very much that is at work in those fictions. Hobbes's most famous book, I think, is Leviathan, not The Citizen, a kind of reworking of The Citizen some years later. And here he explains this thing about fear being at the root of society. More strongly, he says, look, nature's made everybody so equal, really, that even the weakest person can kill the strongest person. Therefore, if any two men desire the same thing, which they can't both have, they become enemies, and they endeavour to destroy or to subdue one another. There's no way for any man to secure himself so reasonable as anticipation. And by anticipation I mean by force or wiles, to master the persons of all men he can, so long till he see no other power great enough to endanger him. So this leads to a situation in which there's a kind of warfare between people, in which you try and gain power so that you get what you want. It's kind of Jacob Zuma theory, I suppose. In this theory, and this is the most famous passage, which you may well have heard the key parts from, every man is an enemy to every man. In such condition, there's no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently there's no culture of the earth, there's no navigation, nor use for the commodities that may be imported by sea, there's no commodious building, there's no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. The life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And that's what the state of nature would be like before their society. So how does society come together? Well, its roots lie in fear. So the answer is fear. The monarch must have absolute power of life and death over all citizens. Fear can only be defeated by absolute political power. You see, kind of echoes of this, I think, in the contemporary politics of fear as engineered through social media by Russian trolls and many, many others, as they literally make fear the driving force for voting for Trump or for Brexit or for whatever. So Hobbes definitely has some explanatory power. As you can see, it describes many contemporary things, and as you read the books, or look at the books, or we talk about the books, you'll see that that is definitely one of the key features in these narratives, like The Road and so on. Hobbes grew up in and through Britain's Civil War. He was very scarred by that. His political theory comes from that experience. Decades later, times have changed. Scotland, in particular, is beginning to do